Greetings, everyone, and thanks for joining us again on one of our special discussions about how you can go big with your marketing and fundraising to achieve really big results for your important cause. Very excited about the topic today. We've got Stephen Clouse, who's an Emmy Award-winning film producer. He has used his experience to take this into the fundraising space and through different medium. We'll get into some of those examples. But he is superb in giving advice about how you should show up for a meeting and how, frankly, others see you. We don't always think about that. But if you consider the 80-20 rule, you're familiar with that, I'm sure, that 80% of a group's revenue tends to come from only 20% of its supporters. And you may know that that's been updated in recent years to say maybe it's 90-10, that 90% of your revenue comes from 10% of your donors. And then there's some who've argued that it's 95-5, that 95% of your revenue comes from 5% of your donors. And the late, great Jerry Panis even said he thought it was 98-2, that 98% of your support actually comes from 2% of your donors. Well, what that means is you could focus exclusively on that 2%, but that wouldn't be a very good idea because it's hard to know who's going to turn into that 2%. You want to make a great impression with all of your potential major donors, but along the way, when you're working with those potential major donors, you want to think through how you can develop and cultivate the right relationship. And how you make that first impression really can be everything. So, Stephen, I'd like you to kick it off. You're highly accomplished and experienced in this area. Why is how you make that first impression with the donor so very important?
Well, Kevin, let me begin by thanking you in advance for this time to be with you and the distinguished fundraisers that are on this call. It's a real privilege. I'd love some of them to put in the chat where they're calling in from. I'd love to know if you're different parts of the US or globe. It would be fun to catch up with everyone. I want to begin with a story of seeing a presidential candidate years ago who had made a speech, and the convention, it went long at the convention, and he was practically booed off the stage. And when he left that convention, he then took coaching from a guy named Michael Sheehan and spent a lot of time on his visual and his vocal. And that man completely flipped and became the president of the United States. It was Bill Clinton from Arkansas. And I say that, and it created an intense curiosity. And I set this up at the time. How does this apply towards not only video, but also to how we market ourselves? How do we come across to others? And so that started a quest. I spent time with some amazing people who work with various presidents and in fundraising. The late Jerry Panis was absolutely passionate about this. But let me ask you guys a question. With how fast do you think you are judged visually when they first meet you? Just maybe type something in the chat if you have a chance to put it in there. So here is the facts on that. In the first 5 seconds, when you go to meet someone, they've already begun to judge you visually. Number two, when they hear you speak, and this is essential because I've trained people at very high levels to run for office and also in fundraising, that's when they begin to judge your intellect. Are you smart enough to solve the challenges that they face? And last, it's actually the words. Now, we're not saying words are not important. They're very, very important. But how you show up creates an atmosphere for how you come off with people. So let me share a study with you. It's really remarkable. UCLA studied the power of first impressions. 10,000 consumers were asked the main reason they said yes to a salesperson. And the answer overwhelmingly was the confidence they showed when they first walked in and how they approached us at the beginning. Think about that. Within just a few minutes, they are determining are you confident to solve some of these challenges that they're dealing with? And then the next area I want to share with you is because the reason that this matters is how many of you have been on a, a donor meeting, an interview with a donor, and you just really have a connection with that donor's heart and mind. And you really develop a deep rapport, and it makes all the difference. So what we find is that people actually go through a very specific process when they meet someone. It goes through awareness. They're getting knowledge about you. They're really determining whether or not they like you. And this is vital because if you like someone, they're a lot more open to what you have to say. And from there, it goes to their conviction. They now prefer you and the organization you represent. And then finally, that leads to giving. So with that in mind, I mean, if you can kind of get one simple thing, words plus presence equals success. And I'm going to have a series of tips to share with you throughout this call, and we'll send you something as a follow-up. But I want you to think how do I show up? How do I project confidence? How do I show empathy and understanding with the donor?
All right, Stephen, tell us how we communicate. I think we tend to think that so much is logical, but also so much is verbal. And you say that's actually not the case.
That's right, Kevin. That's a good point. So we know that when you first meet someone, and this is critical, so much of what today's call covers is meeting someone for the first time. But when you first meet someone, it's almost unbelievable, but the studies on this, over 55% of how we learn is straight up visuals. So they're going to look at things like posture, clothing, hair, face size, and they're going to come across with some ideas about who you are. And then the next area is actually the voice. And the voice is so important because that's going to communicate to the conviction that you have, your impact that you want to make with them. And then finally, it gets into the words. So it's 55% visual, Kevin, 38% actually the quality of the voice and how it's coming across. Finally gets to 7%. And I remember Jerry talking about this as well. Jerry had a great voice. He was very intentional. I think it's important for those of us in fundraising to look ways, how can we up our game in this area?
Then how do you recommend we plan for success? What are some of the individual steps we should take? How should we think about it? How should we plan ahead of time? What would you advise?
Right. Well, I have a series of points. I'm happy to send these out today, but I'd like the first thing you to think about is so I'm going to step back for just a brief moment. What are my objectives for this meeting? What am I hoping to accomplish? And then from that, what are the donors' expectations for that meeting as we're heading in? So if you can I love this. Someone once taught me the 4 Ps, and I love it. If you can pre-plan, practice, perfect, and perform. And I would like to encourage each one of you on the call to write the 4 Ps down. You need to do perhaps a little more pre-planning before you have the donor meeting. Kevin, you and I have friends that do tremendous pre-planning. Then others, I find they kind of wing it. They just show up. And so the problem with that is you don't have the interest of the donor at heart. And then what are the donors' expectations for that meeting? What are they hoping to accomplish? What do they think that where you want to take them? And then and I've done hundreds and hundreds of interviews with donors, and what are the most important questions to ask? So what is the most, for example, if Jerry Panis were with us, he'd say, what is the most they've ever given to something? What good is it to go out and actually meet with someone who's a donor prospect, but they're not in the habit of philanthropy and they're not in the habit of giving? The next one is there a question, and Jerry did this great, is there a power question that reveals their passion and interest? And he tells this wonderful story of meeting with Tom Monahan. And so he started Domino's Pizza. He owned a baseball team in Detroit, plays the Tigers. And then he also he started 2 universities, thinking that oh, Tom's going to say, I did this, I did this, I did this. And Kevin, you know what Tom said? He said, when I joined the Marines, it was the greatest day of my life. And Jerry said it was so instructive because it revealed Tom's integrity, his patriotism for the flag, his love of country, and what he cared about. And that created a 1 hour conversation just on that area. So as you begin to pre-plan, what are the questions that you want to ask that reveal the heart? What's the heart, the passion and the interest of that donor? And don't forget to do follow-up. When they make a comment, feel free to ask, well, why do you feel that way? Tell me more about that. And what you'll often get, Kevin, you'll even get a better in-depth answer that'll come after that first question. And then last, what do you want to take on the visit? How do you want to create? I'm a big fan of creating physical involvement with that donor. You want to hand them a video. You want to hand them a video player. Do you want to have something, a report? When I worked on other big we would have huge boards that we would design and show this is what can be. And we would involve that donor and ask them to give feedback. What would you change? What do you like about this? What would you improve upon? So you're really hearing them out on how you get to be successful. And
Stephen,
then last,
yeah,
my last point is the great Mike Lanzera always says about the importance of enthusiasm is how will I inject enthusiasm and excitement into this meeting? So.
All right. Well, I want to invite folks to use the Q&A to ask any questions as follow-up to what you just shared, but I've got a few questions too. I will note Jerry Pennis was also a big fan of the book Power Questions, and we can put that in the follow-up to everybody. It's a great way to think about engaging with somebody in a meeting. But Stephen, let's go back more to the planning part. I couldn't agree more, and I've fallen into this trap so many times. You plan ahead, you schedule the meeting, but maybe the travel is pretty intense, and you've got some commercial error, and get a rental car, and you rush to the meeting, and you get there, and you maybe are not as prepared as would be warranted based on the prospective gift that you're talking about, or certainly the long-term value of the relationship. And so I'd love you to comment on that, but comment a little bit more on how we should prepare. I know you're an advocate for actually having us record ourselves and then looking at it.
That's right, Kevin. The camera is a powerful tool. How many ever looked at a photograph and looked at the first thing you look at is yourself, right? Or if you see yourself in a video, how do I look? How do I sound? But the reason it matters, and I use it on every single training, is that you see yourself as others see you. And sometimes that's hard because you have this opinion or this perception of how I'm really coming across. And so we find just use your iPad camera. You could use your iPhone camera, but take a shot of it and do some practicing after we get done with this call today. And there's ways you can really make tremendous upgrades.
All right, well, let's walk through some more how-tos. Let's go through those three components you talked about. Let's start with the visual. What are some things that we should be thinking about? And then we'll go into the vocal and the verbal.
Great question, Kevin. So the visual matters because it's how essential human learning takes place. But there are three really quick things I want you to write down is that if you have an open body language, it is amazing. I was with somebody the other day. They were like this with the donor leaning back. And so having open body language, actually a beam, just a great smile, and actually leaning in the donor. It seems like it should be automatic. It doesn't always happen that way. So for me, the first thing that I look at, and Kevin, you mentioned, you and I talked about the late Charlton Heston, who was a pleasure to work with. So the first thing that he would deal with was his posture. And so he looks for, it's called, and you all should write this down on the call. It's called a winning coach posture. And I want you to get an image of a person who's walking off the field. And I'm on the screen right now. So You tell me who I am walking off the field. Am I the winning coach or am I the losing coach? Did you guys see that? What do you think? Winning coach or losing coach? I'm not seeing that in the chat, but if you're a football fan, that is absolutely the losing coach. And so what you want to practice is you want to have your chin up parallel with the floor, and you actually should walk very confidently into that room. Because as a champion, if you're going to be a champion fundraiser, you need to look important and have vibrancy when you're walking to me. So the first point is winning, a winning coach posture. The next thing is just keeping the gestures. I'm not going to get a lot into that. I'll share some of that in some detailed follow-up. The clothing, how are you dressing for the meeting? And my advice is you always dress as someone they take advice from. So if you're calling on a donor who's a farmer in North Dakota, a successful farmer, you want to dress like a very successful farmer. You should be one notch above them. And I'll send some nice details that'll come out in that. I can go into that. But usually for clothing, we look at elegant plain clothes that are one notch up from the person that we're meeting with. And, we see this playing out. It's interesting politics right now, what people are wearing and seeing how that comes through. The hair, just try to be careful with the hair that it doesn't get in the eyes. I don't have a problem with that with most fundraisers. But here is a facial expression, an interesting thing we learn from television. And I sometimes see it true in fundraising, and that it's so important to have a sincere smile. And one of the ways that actors achieve that is you actually do an exercise. And it's called the EO exercise. And Kevin, this is kind of a funny thing, but my friend Tony Lobianco, who you were familiar with, they would do this. There's 55 muscles in the face. And before you meet a donor, you might want to think about, just because you're tense, you're nervous, you don't want to bring that nervous energy into the meeting. And they'll do this little E-O, E-O, E-O. And if you do that for like a minute, 30 seconds to a minute, it makes all the difference in the world. Now, of smiles, there's just two you need. There's 19 smiles. There's only two you need to know. The first one is a little pinch on the cheek. And you'll see me right now on camera. And there is a slight pull. My teeth are not revealed. But the one that they react to, they know you're sincere and authentic, is this one here. It actually crinkles the eyes. If you look carefully at what I'm doing right now, that's a very important technique in how you come off. And that last, just make good eye contact, team. I mean, you're engaging this donor. When you have good eye contact with them, it makes all the difference in the world. And so that's the visual side, Kevin, in a nutshell.
All right, Stephen, and thank you. And our chat is now enabled, so you can use that function to quiz folks a little bit more. But one follow-up question we got was, is it possible to dress too formally?
Again, if you're one notch above them, kind of where they are, I think you're fine. It just.
All right, thank you.
I hope that answers that.
Yeah, so another question, Stephen, is just briefly on the Zoom call. I mean, we're talking mostly about in-person interactions with our prospective donors. But what about on Zoom calls? Is there one thing that you might really recommend that relates to the visual? I know you worked with Mike Deaver, who was the guy who was so very, very good and gifted in working with President Ronald Reagan about how he came across in public settings. Is there something that you might recommend?
I would say lighting, Kevin, is absolutely essential. And so having, like right now, I have a little key light, a soft key light on me. My background is blurred slightly, but having lighting is very, very critical to the shot. Once you get beyond lighting, it's intimacy to the camera. And so like right now, I can get closer to the camera or I can pull back like this. It depends. what you want to accomplish. There are moments in time when you're going to want to lean into the frame to make an essential point. And I think you should practice that as you think about that meeting with the donor, whether that meeting takes place face to face or virtually. Great question, Kevin.
All right. Well, give us some advice on the vocal component of our meetings.
You know, this is one of my favorite elements. Kevin, you and I have worked together for a long time, and you've heard me coach on this, but it's not enough to say the words, they have to feel the words. And I was working with a presidential candidate a while back, and this person was extremely smart, could talk very quickly. And we developed the habit of slowing him down so people could feel the words. And the difference, team on this call, was night and day. He saw the audience response, he felt it. And so it's not enough for you to say something. They have to feel, is there conviction in what you're saying and how you're saying it? Because they're hearing a lot of pitches. By the way, I hate the word pitch. I think you all should, jettison the word pitch. We give eloquent presentations. And so when we're doing a presentation, we want to make sure that they feel our conviction in what we're talking about. And so that's my point number one. To accomplish that, it's actually getting the right pace. We know that historically, most great presidents talk at about 125 to 150 words per minute. That allows you to be perfectly understood. You enunciate the consonants at the beginning and end of each word. And so just like I'm saying right now, there's no doubt in your mind what I'm saying and how I'm saying it. So think about your words. You know, I worked with a gentleman now, very high level economist, not long ago. And he was telling me this was transformative, this insight, because he went home and he started reading books to his kids at night. But his goal was to make sure he had better enunciation. He would vary the volume and then look for, what are the words that I really want to punch? What do I want to use that I would extend vowels and have more impact? And I found that to be one of the little keys, Kevin, honestly, is when you extend vowels, they feel the words more. And my youngest daughter, when she used to come home and she would say, I love you, Dad. That was great. But when she would come home and she says, I love you, Dad, which do you prefer? And all I did is I just took the vowels and I slightly extended that. And I've done this in fundraising videos hundreds of times. Just take people and slow down the delivery so people feel the words. I need your help. So that kind of thing. So.
Well, Stephen, before we take it to the last point, which is the verbal component and the smallest,
Right.
would you tell us again just some practical advice about how we might record ourselves and look at ourselves? Because you've now talked about both the visual and the verbal. And I think you're right. I think we just don't realize how we might come across in terms of our smile, come across in terms of our eye contact,
That's right.
our posture, but also how we enunciate, how quickly we speak, how clearly we speak. So what do you recommend? Do we just record on our iPhone and take a look at it? What do you suggest?
Yeah, I would recommend recording from your iPhone. If you can get AirPods like I am right now, that helps to hear it played back and get picked up, because what happens is the microphone isn't very good in a smartphone. So you're going to hear your voice and it's going to sound terrible. I was working with someone on a big podcast, national podcast, a while back, and they were using their phone and the audio was just awful. So yeah, have a good set of AirPods, frame the shot, play with it, look at lighting. So like the room that I'm in right now, there's a certain amount of exterior lighting coming in, which is a different color temperature than inside. So you have to adjust for that. Never, ever, ever have the brightest light be behind you. It's going to blow the shot out and make you not look very good on camera, or with you're on a Zoom with a donor. So you want to be very sensitive to some of those kinds of things. But yeah, maybe get a little tripod for your iPhone or your iPad or your computer and just do some practice. Practice. and then see what looks good, play it back, maybe share it with a loved one, and get their reaction to it.
All right, well, let's close this out. If you want to walk us through the verbal, and then I'd like you to finish up with just some last specific steps that you'd recommend we take to make better first impressions with these meetings.
That's great. Thank you, Kevin. So here's just some verbal side. These are more presentation aspects of it. But if you can really spend time thinking through what is the challenge that I'm coming to talk with that donor about, because what's going to move them is there a need? Is there a challenge that they can help you solve? And then what's the solution to that challenge? And most of us, we don't have a problem talking about the challenge. It's more about getting the solution that'll solve that challenge. And then from there, what is my opening? How do I open with my donor? Do I want to ask a question? Do we want to make a statement? Do we want to, some things that I like to do a certain amount of chit chat, but I also find what are the things in common ground? What do I share in common with that donor? And so I might look around, I look carefully, listen closely, and I give attention to things that would allow us for a period of time to have a deeper conversation, maybe than just about the direct things at hand. Now, sometimes people just want to get into it, and that can happen as well. And then lastly, just sincere compliments. People are starved in this country for sincere compliments. And so if you see something, you just did an exceptional job with that over here. It actually can, and again, it has to be authentic, has to be real. That can have a fabulous impact. And then remember, don't get too caught up in details. Tell stories, sell the dream. That's what people want. Kevin, you had something you wrote a while back about telling about the dream. And that's just so true when it comes to fundraising. And so, yeah.
Thanks, Stephen. And by the way, it's widely advised that we all tend to just tell too many details in a story, and we've got to be clearer and more succinct. All right, I want to wrap this up. I promised a half-hour call, but if anybody wants to stay and answer, take some of your questions, take questions, I'm glad to do that. I have a few in the queue that I can ask you, but just give us some final advice on how we can leave this call and do better at what we do.
I think if there was one thing and one thing only, I would just really want you to be, first of all, really love the donors that you're working with. There's an old saying I like to use: people want to work with people who love people and use power, not love power and use people. I think they should sense your heart. They should sense your mind on this. And so how you show up, there's an attitude to it that comes through. And that I often like to tell, if you have dollar signs in your eyes, that'll undermine it, the reason for your coming. And but yeah, how you show up, the attitude of your heart. You're there to serve the donor. You're to serve their interests, and pair that with the nonprofit that you work with. So, and you do that by showing up powerfully for the meeting, when you're open, when you're smiling, and you're developing that relationship, and you're learning more. They're excited, you're excited. It's a terrific partnership, Kevin, to solve big problems.
All right, excellent. Well, I have a few questions in the queue, so if you can stay a few minutes, and if folks would like to stay 5 more minutes, you're welcome to. But thank you, Stephen, as always. One of the questions we have is, what is the one thing we shouldn't do, or we need to make sure we don't do in a meeting with a donor?
Okay. Well, first of all, never come in negative and be so distracted. You've got to have your mind 110% on the purpose at hand. And then the second thing I'm going to add is nothing. Keep your hands below your chin. Keep it down here. If you start going up here and messing with your hair and you're like that, you have to be careful about where you place your hands and what you do, things like that. So those are two things.
All right. Should we be conscious of our regional accents? Do we need to focus on sounding more like a news broadcaster from the Midwest, or does it matter?
Right. It's a great question. So when I first moved to Washington about 25 years ago, and I now live in Florida, I had the pleasure of meeting with Mrs. Lillian Brown. She worked with 6 U.S. presidents. Very impressive. There would never be another person like her. And her Ohio accent at one point in time had been very strong. And I moved with a Wisconsin accent, Kevin, as you know. And so I was very nasally pronounced. So if I speak like this, I can actually go back to Wisconsin. Shall we go to Green Bay and get some cheese today? I can talk from the front of my face like this. And what I actually had to do to the team that's on the call, I actually had to work in dropping the pitch of my voice so it went through my diaphragm. So a lot of people use the sinus cavities in front of the face, and it causes you to have a higher pitch. It's not as pleasant, it's not as resonant. But if you can use the diaphragm like I did just now, you'll hear that my voice drops several octaves. And I've done this for very significant political people. And they'll hear the difference because you're more pleasant, you're more resonant, and people want to pay attention.
All right.
Fabulous question.
We'll send a lot of your pointers out to everybody by email at the end of this, but here's the final question. The ask. When it comes time to make the ask, how would you recommend we think about that?
3 words: with your approval, comma, John, Mary, whoever's in the meeting, will be able to put your gift to work on doing X. And then be quiet, shut up. It's very hard. But once you've made an eloquent presentation, the ask should not be difficult. The ask should be very easy because you've qualified them. This is a project they're interested in. They like what they see. They're pleased with you. They're interested in it. And your goal now is just to ask the final question. And so, John, Mary, with your approval, we'd like to get working on this right away. Do you think you can help us meet this deadline of September 31?
All right. Sorry, one more question has come in, and that is,
okay, go ahead.
How do we think about planning out the timing of our meeting? The worst thing that could happen is that we just haven't gotten to the end and suddenly the meeting needs to come to a close. The person's assistant comes in and says, you need to take a call or you need to go to lunch now or whatever it may be. How do we think about planning out our timing?
Right. That's a good question. So I think once you're in, first of all, it depends on the individual. If I had a little more detail, would be great. But obviously, things change, things come up. And so you have to be really focused not to let things run amok. And so I believe that within 10 or 15 minutes, you should be able to connect at some level with that donor's heart and mind and start talking, having conversation. But the key, and this is the key, Kevin, and I wrote this in my notes to you, is you have to have a get down to business point. And so one of the things that I have in my notes, and maybe Kevin can pick it up and send it out, but at some point in time, when you've connected with that donor, you have to say, John, Mary, let me begin by thanking you so much for the time that we shared. I want to talk to you now. I need to talk to you now about this incredible opportunity that we have to change the outcome of this election, to change the outcome of XY University, but there needs to be some statement that you make that shifts the conversation so you don't lose track. And so you need to pre-plan as fundraisers, what does my get down to business statement look like so we're not squandering our time and wasting it?
All right, Stephen Clouse, thank you for joining us today. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. We'll be sending out some follow-up notes. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to follow up. There's nothing like that first impression. And as Stephen says, it's very difficult to come back and try it with a second first impression. All right, thank you again. We'll be back to you soon. And don't forget to stay focused on all those things that can enable you to go big. Looking forward to being with you again. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.